Skynet, HAL 9000, Ultron, The Matrix. Fictional depictions of artificial intelligences have played a major role in Western pop culture for decades. While nowhere near that nefarious or powerful, real AI has been making incredible strides and, in 2023, has been a big topic of conversation in the news with the rapid development of new technologies, the use of AI-generated images, and AI chatbots such as ChatGPT becoming freely accessible to the general public. This month, we'll be looking at the role AI currently plays in our lives and the impact it can have as it develops and becomes more mainstream. Should AI be accessible to all? How does gender influence the way AI is made? And most importantly, what are the hopes and fears for the future of AI? This is Hope Jennings-Grounds with the Oxford Comment. On today's episode, we discuss how AI can be influenced by culture, feminism, and the aforementioned Western narratives defined by popular TV shows and films. How can these aspects change the way AI continues to develop and be used? For our first interview, we have Dr. Kerry Mcinerney and Dr. Eleanor Drage, postdoctoral research associates at the Centre for Gender Studies at the University of Cambridge, and two of the editors of the upcoming book, Feminist AI, Critical Perspectives on Data, Algorithms, and Intelligent Machines. Both have been recognised as brilliant women in AI ethics for 2022 by the global initiative Women in Ethics.
Hello, we're here with Dr. Eleanor Drage and Dr. Kerry Mcinerney. Can you please introduce yourselves for us? How did you get involved in your field?
Hi, I'm Eleanor Drage, and I have the great pleasure of working with Kerry, who's also here today. And we work for a place called the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, which is based at the University of Cambridge. And I got in it through a really strange path. I did a literature undergrad and French and specialised in queer theory and feminist literature. And I kind of realised that a lot of people who try to imagine better times and spaces, better places to live, other worlds, were also thinking about that through the lens of science fiction, through speculative fiction. They were imagining these other spaces and times. And so that kind of got me into science fiction, which is very closely connected to AI. And I think we'll talk about that in a bit. So I'm quite interested in the overlaps between feminist and utopian philosophy, and queer theory and anti-racist ideas and technology.
And I'm Kerry Mcinerney, and so yes, I also have the pleasure of working with Eleanor. I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, but moved to the UK when I was about 18 and have a degree in politics and international relations. And so I'm really interested in the geopolitical aspects of AI, but was lucky enough to be brought in touch with Eleanor on a gender and technology project at the University of Cambridge Centre for Gender Studies, which is where my interest in feminist AI really developed. And I now bring a lot of the things that I learned in that first research role on the Gender and Tech project into my current role, where I look at AI and human values, or broadly thinking about AI ethics in the context of the EU.
Thanks for having us, by the way. I forgot to say, it's great to be on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. You are both editors of the upcoming book, Feminist AI, which has a focus on feminism in AI and how it should be deployed for social justice. Can you talk us through how this can be achieved? Are there any quick wins? And where could it have the most impact?
Yeah, sure. I'll kick us off. I think when we started conceptualizing this volume, Feminist AI, it was hugely challenging for us because we don't think there's one such thing as feminism. We think there's this massive cacophony of different kinds of feminisms, plural. And so how do we even begin to capture the incredible breadth of feminist thinking that there is, while also trying to combat some of the different trends we see in feminist activism right now, particularly trans-exclusionary radical feminisms or TERFisms that we think are really harmful. And so putting together this volume, though, made us realize that there is space for many of these different kinds of, bountiful and beautiful feminisms to be coexisting. And that includes the kinds of feminism which ask for very, very slow change, that are maybe working incrementally within the tech industry to try and bring about reforms to make tech that's better and fairer, through to these really radical kinds of approaches, which are saying, actually, we need to completely overthrow how we currently think about and make tech, or we need to have complete moratoriums on certain technologies like predictive policing. And so I think rather than saying we can, only have particular kinds of quick fixes or that we can only have these big structural changes, I think the volume has really helped me to grapple with the way that change can happen at so many different paces and in so many different ways.
Yeah, very nicely put. I am always very skeptical of the idea of a quick win. Even things that you think were quick wins weren't. In the case of, queer rights, all those, things that seem to have come really quickly absolutely took forever, and were the product of many steps back. I was also thinking of something when, Kerry, you're talking about pluralism and why we want to have a plurality of voices and whether we actually succeed in having a plurality of voices. And to me, pluralism sort of seems to imply that there's at least a kind of not really an equality of ideas, but to have lots of ideas on the table that are equally listened to or listened to together or sort of in the same way. And that is really not true. I don't think we can present it as all these ideas take this up the same amount of space, or they are kind of equally bought into by feminism. Not at all. I mean, if you just look at the contributors, they're mainly based at institutions in the West, and that's because that's where the funding is for feminist work on AI. As one of our colleagues pointed out, it's really not a priority in lots of places to think about a feminist approach to AI. So we're really conscious of where we failed as well, and we think that that's really important, and we try and write about that in the introduction. I think another thing I really wanted to say was to give an example of what feminist AI can contribute to the world. One of the most important principles in feminism, in data science and AI is context. Context really matters, which means that things can't be developed at scale ad infinitum. It means that what if we built an AI system in your house? If you built something with your family that served a particular need, would we be less afraid of AI? Would that actually be more useful than something that is, built by Microsoft? We have no control over it. So context is really crucial, where the data comes from, where it's used, who it's used for, who are the people building it. And I think that kind of building something at home, although there's lots of issues with that kind of metaphor, I think that's quite an interesting way of asking, of thinking about what feminist principles do in AI.
Thanks so much. What are your fears if a feminist approach isn't to be taken as AI usage grows? And how could future AI technology differ if this isn't the chosen route?
I was reading the, that letter written by the Future of Humanity Institute about what we should be worried about, the great fears of AI that's going to take over and we'll all die. And it struck me that the authors are people who imagine utopia as a place of radically enhanced posthumans, colonized space, digital people, etc. I mean, that's certainly not my utopia. And so when they cry for a forthcoming apocalypse, I really think about that apocalypse. I don't know why people seem to think that Elon Musk is definitely the person to listen to if he's calling for something. I think actually really sensible people think that, which is bizarre. I was on this show called Moral Maze on BBC4 last week, and a really sort of sensible, intelligent person was saying, yeah, but Elon Musk is saying this, so why should we not listen? And that struck me as a really odd and sort of upsetting thing, because when we think about fears, not everyone is afraid in the same way, because we're not going to be affected in the same way. If there is some kind of apocalypse, is that an apocalypse in the West? Because there's already a digital apocalypse in South Africa, the way that infrastructure is right now. AI has a very differential effect around the world. So we need to keep asking apocalypse for who. Kerry, do you want to say anything on that before I go on to something else?
Yeah, I know. I think this question of like fears around what happens if AI doesn't take a kind of feminist bend, if we don't see like a meaningful transformation of the tech industry as it stands. I think there's like a myriad of different fears that certainly shape how I'm approaching this, from kind of the continued exclusion of women from the tech industry, the intensification of the gender pay gap, the environmental costs of these technologies. But I think actually one of my really big fears that we maybe don't talk about is that we start to lose the ability to see life without AI. And I think we almost see this in certain cities. Like, for example, I was just in Durham, North Carolina a couple of weeks ago. It's very hard to get around that city without a car. And I think to some extent, I wonder if we start to do that with our own lives when it comes to the kinds of technologies that actually become indispensable to us. We've seen how hard it is to disengage from lots of big tech platforms. And, I think at the moment we're at this juncture where we can start to ask these questions of actually, do we want these technologies to be inevitable? Do we want them to be woven into the fabric of our daily lives in such a way that they're inextricable? And I think that's a really important question that we need to be asking rather than plunging headfirst into this automated future.
Totally. There's this thing with capitalism, Tina, there is no alternative. It's a really closeted way of thinking about the world. And if you're a paper reading sort of person, there's a really good paper by Johnny Penn, who's our colleague at CFI, who writes about algorithmic silence. And it doesn't mean a kind of total moratorium of all algorithms. It just means thinking about where actually these things are useful and where we really don't need them, where it's just about throwing AI onto a product label and selling it for more money.
That's really interesting. Thank you. The gender gap is often different around the world. How could AI widen or narrow these gaps? Are there any examples of countries or projects where things are going well?
Yeah, I think looking at the differences in global contexts is really, really important when we're thinking about AI and gender inequality. Because I think on the one hand, you're right to point out that actually there's places where certain kinds of gender-related issues in AI are actually looking a lot better. So for example, the UK, where I'm based right now, is particularly poor when it comes to women's representation in the tech industry. Whereas in other countries, for example, in Egypt, there's much better representation, I think, of women in computer science and in things like running AI conferences. But at the same time, I think on the other hand, one of the challenges of AI is even as it's taken up very differently in local contexts, it's still quite a narrow number of industry sort of playmakers, people like OpenAI, Meta, who control a huge amount of compute resources and who are really exercising such a disproportionate amount of control over the technologies that we consume. And these tend to be located in a very narrow range of geographical locations like the US and China. And then they give those countries really outsized influence in a lot of other spaces, which has led to these critiques and these complaints that we might be seeing new forms of colonialism, neocolonialism arise through the outreach of digital technologies. So I think that's one big important thing for me. And the other one is that, I think it's also important that we do look at AI in local context, but that we also look at the planetary impact of these technologies. So, for example, we've seen a lot of excitement around ChatGPT and other large language models, but these models are intensely environmentally destructive. They use huge amounts of energy and they release large amounts of CO2. And there's well-documented evidence around environmental racism and sexism that women in the majority world tend to bear the vast majority of this environmental degradation and the harms associated with it. So I think it's definitely important to look at how all these different inequalities are playing out.
Yeah, I mean, really nicely put. And what's really worrying at the moment is that you have these kind of big tech investors like Chamath Palihapitiya, who were saying that all this stuff, asking, well, the example that he used is basically like woke people, whatever that means, saying that one particular piece of technology or AI doesn't work in the Amazon for all Amazon languages or in like Amazonian context, which is a really, weird example anyway. And he called that elite language. And he said that big tech needs to stop talking in elite language and just get down to the nuts and bolts of what sells and what can sell quickly and how products can become more profitable. And that struck me as interesting because the people, the populations that he was talking about and in this kind of weird way are not elites. So perhaps, Kerry and I are elites in an elite institution. That's totally fine. I don't care if, people like him call us that. That's totally fine. But to think of these problems as elite problems when actually they're not at all about elites. It strikes me as really cruel. And this kind of cruelty you see a lot in big tech. And so when they're worried about apocalypse, it's not a kind of, oh, we're worried on your behalf. I think it would be really wrong and quite naive to think that.
Thank you. According to a 2018 study from Wired and Element AI, just 12% of AI researchers globally are female. Has this improved in the past 5 years from your experience? And how do we encourage more women into the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I mentioned in the last answer that there are variations, of course, in terms of context, but I think we can still see, globally there being this massive disparity of women and gender minorities compared to men, and particularly white men in the field of AI, and that this really does impact, who the universal user of a technology is imagined to be, and also who products are being made for and what kinds of concerns are being embedded within these technologies. And so, we think that there's this wide range of reasons for this, from kind of systemic exclusions and harassment in the industry itself, but also gender stereotyping. And so something that Eleanor and I have done, along with a couple of our colleagues from the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, Dr. Stephen Cave and Dr. Kanta Dihal, is look at how representations of AI scientists on film might themselves be shaping our cultural expectations of who is seen as an AI engineer or who counts as an AI scientist. And we actually have a chapter in the book, Feminist AI, which reflects on some of the findings from this study. But we surveyed 100 years of science fiction film that we deemed that were popular, and we found that only 8% of these AI creators and scientists on screen were gendered female or were presented as women, which is way lower than even in real life. And so we basically call for Hollywood and for the creative industries to be trying to tell different stories about who counts as an AI engineer, because we really need to start propagating different kinds of societal narratives. These films are incredibly important in generating our conceptions of technology, but also who makes these technologies.
And a lot of those bots are naked, like in Ghost in the Shell. You've got Scarlett Johansson in some kind of outfit that makes her look like she's just in skin. I mean, that's kind of the point. And at a time when female actresses are declining to be naked on screen, or you have these contracts that stipulate what they will and won't show, it strikes me as interesting that female nudity is being replaced by female bot nudity. And so I think we need to be really conscious also of kind of the flip side, also what the bots look like. I also wanted to get people to think a bit about not just women in the workplace, but also the narrative around AI. And currently at the moment, it's very masculinized, either very militarized, very corporatized, and all this kind of fear mongering. I wouldn't go into it. I wouldn't work in AI if I was choosing now as a young engineer or young STEM professional or a young linguist or whatever. So we need to think carefully about how the field is being portrayed, the kind of narrative and storytelling around a discipline, and whether that is attracting women or not.
Yeah, and just to speak as well to the latter half of your question around, has this changed much in the last 5 years, and what we can be doing to encourage more women to this field. Like, I think the point that Eleanor raises around narrative is really important. But I want to first caveat my answer here by saying I have a huge amount of respect for a large number of incredible women who are very much embedded in the field of AI, who are working really, really hard to try and bring about a lot of transformative changes. But at the same time, I think we've seen some really high-profile disappointments over the past 5 years, particularly the firing of Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell from Google from the ethical AI team, and also just more broadly the shutting down of a lot of ethical AI teams from Twitter to Microsoft. And I think this leads with a really bad example for women and minoritized people, and also just for anyone who's interested in the social and political impact of their work. Why would you then want to be going into that field? And so I think in order to get more women and more people who aren't represented in this field in, something that we really have to do is just look at the cultures of these organizations and saying, like, actually, what can we do to transform these workplaces to make them just simply better and more attractive places to work? Because there's often a huge focus on recruitment, on the so-called pipeline problem, which is how people somehow, quote unquote, drop out of the pipeline along the way. So you get fewer and fewer women represented at higher levels of organizations. I think we need to flip that question around and say, why will you not promote women, for example, in your organization? Like, why are women leaving your organization? Is this a comfortable and safe place for people to work? Because I don't think there's any point in us trying to increase the attractiveness of this field if they're going to enter these companies and then just immediately get thrown to the sharks. So yeah, I think that it's really important that we're thinking both at a kind of societal and cultural level about what kinds of stereotypes and factors might be inhibiting people from wanting to enter this field, but also within the fields themselves, what structural changes really need to happen.
Totally. And I know that we can be really bum out, but it's also worth saying that all the people in the book are incredibly interesting, really like spectacularly interesting, wonderful, kind people. And we loved writing it and working with them. And so while the situation is, as Kerry said, dire in big tech, it's also worth knowing that you can join organizations like DAIR, DAIR, which was founded by some of the people who were fired from Google, forced to leave. And they are a great place for brilliant women and brilliant minorities to gather. If you want to meet some truly fantastic and really insightful people, unfortunately, those are the people that are going to have had a really hard time. You don't get insight for free. You have to go through something really hard. So that's the positive side, is that you get to meet people who are actually really phenomenal.
Thanks so much for that answer. What branch or use of AI has surprised you both the most?
I'm always surprised by how systems like chatbots can be both really advanced and extremely basic. For example, I've got a friend that sells chatbots, and he was saying to me that, well, they're all advertised as AI. Some of them are more like flowcharts. I don't know whether you can think about those kind of yes-no diagrams that we used to do in maths. And to me, that doesn't really kind of figure as AI. That feels very, very basic. But others are algorithmically really advanced, but both kind of count as AI. So on the one hand, that's kind of how I feel about AI generally, is that there's stuff that I'm really unexcited and bored by. And then on the other hand, there's stuff that is tangibly really interesting. And often when you talk to professionals in different industries who work in biotech or drug discovery or marketing, the kinds of AI tools that they're using are really they do excite me. So there's lots of things that are specific to particular industries that are really cool and exciting. Obviously, do have their own kind of problems and issues they throw up around the way that work is changing. But then on the other hand, kind of lots of crap and snake oil that we can do without.
Yeah, I think something that I found really surprising, which is unfortunately like a very negative example, but it's one that really impacted me when I first started researching in this field, was thinking about the way that certain kinds of technologies, and specifically smart home technologies, are used often for the purposes of coercive control or domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Because coming into this field, I was aware of some of the issues to do with smart home technologies and gender that have hit the wider mainstream. So particularly things like the female gendering of voice assistants like Alexa and Siri, and how these might be replicating certain kinds of gender stereotypes, painting women as servile or domestic or positioned to solve your domestic needs, to the extent that some people call them, smart wives. But something I wasn't really aware of is that even beyond this kind of female gendering of these tools, because they allow people to have so much control over domestic space, they can then be used to control people who reside within that space. And so, for example, sometimes one partner might be bringing in a tool, something that allows them to control the locks on the door or to track a partner's spending, ostensibly in the name of convenience or ease, and then actually they can be using that to, say, decide when their partner can or can't leave the house, or to track their spending and question them on it. And so it can really curtail someone's freedom and be used in quite abusive ways. And this just naive me really shocked me, because it was something I hadn't really ever thought about I don't personally have, for example, Stereo Alexa or one of these voice assistants, but it wasn't really because I'd thought about that particular capacity. And I think what this really showed me was the importance of thinking about AI from a feminist lens from all sorts of angles, not just in terms of what kinds of gender stereotypes does it produce, but also have we thought about safety in this scenario? Have we thought about all the different ways that a technology can be exploited or can make someone vulnerable? And how can we make sure that the technologies that we produce are as safe for everyone to use as possible, especially when we take into account existing gender inequalities and patterns of harm?
Thanks, that's really interesting. The user-friendly AI chatbot, ChatGPT, has recently been all over the news. What are your views on it, and do you think that AI should be freely accessible?
It has been all over the news. In fact, it's kind of been made our lives a bit difficult because suddenly everything's about ChatGPT. However, while it's kind of everywhere, not everyone uses it in the same way. So I think at the moment, only developers and people on the list have access to kind of full features. Same with bolt-ons. There's lots of new stuff that people are excited about, but I don't think those are accessible to everyone. And then Kerry was talking earlier about compute. You have to have the right infrastructure to be able to build and use these kinds of tools. So I think we need to think carefully about what we mean by accessible, freely accessible. I'm not really sure. Do you mean kind of freely accessible as it is to users on the internet at the moment?
Yes.
Kerry, what do you think?
It's a really interesting moment right now because I think there's a lot of issues to do with the ethics of these large language models that have had quite a lot of attention in the AI ethics community for a long time. And indeed, the firing of Gebru and Mitchell that I mentioned earlier was related to a confrontation over a really prescient paper called Stochastic Parrots, which explored the ethical and the environmental costs of developing large language models like ChatGPT. And it's a really fantastic paper. So again, if you're a paper reading person, I would highly recommend that you take a look at it. It really captures, I think, some of the core issues that are coming up right now. But then I think what was interesting is we see this discussion around these models hit the mainstream in a really quite unexpectedly large way, because there have been language models before that have been open to public use. I think this one has just somehow captured the public imagination. And so for me, I think what I find really hopeful, I say that with a big caveat about this situation, is that it's an incredibly good starting off point for talking about AI ethics. So asking people, for example, if they understand that this is a statistical model, that it's a predictive model that lets you know what word is statistically most likely to follow the word that came before it. And so it provides form but not meaning, for example. Or do they know about the environmental costs of these models? Again, as I mentioned earlier, that they guzzle huge amounts of energy, release huge amounts of CO2. Are they aware of the way that these models can be used for misinformation and for propaganda? And so the point here, I think, is not necessarily to judge or shame people's meaningful interest in these large language models, or to throw any, disagreement at the way that these models can be really, really valuable for things like generating transcriptions. But instead, to have it as a critical moment for us to step back and reflect and say, okay, we are now entering a stage when we actually all need to have greater literacy around AI ethics because these tools are becoming increasingly accessible. And so how do we have that conversation together as a society?
Yeah, absolutely. It was super well said. And Kerry and I are now working with the OCR, which is an exam board in the UK, to create videos and resources for teachers and students about ChatGPT and what it will do and its role in the classroom and what shouldn't be its role in the classroom. And I think what's interesting to me is that, poor teachers are thinking, well, are people going to write essays and how do we regulate that? And of course, the classroom is a place of learning. It's not a place of content generation. God knows, the stuff I produced at school was pretty subpar. It's somewhere that you have to learn how to think and to write. And teachers already know that. But I think what Kerry has just said is so important for students to realize that actually what they're generating has some value, but not in the way that they think it does. And I don't think it will be that difficult, I say optimistically, to get people to use it in the right way. I'm also really interested in what it means to become kind of an ethical prompter with ChatGPT, writing prompts in a way that produces the right kind of content, or how to create these relationships between humans and ChatGPT, that when you are kind of talking to each other, how that relationship is going to develop in the future. So there's lots of things to think about when we use it. The first order effects are always really boring. Like the first things that people do with it, like create poems. Like the poems suck. I'm sorry. I think they suck. I'm a literature student. And I think that the people who love them don't read Yeats or any of the great poets. I look forward to the things that come after, when we've had a chance to really think about what it can give to humankind and think slowly, rather than just, oh, what's the coolest parlor trick I can think of right now?
My final question is, what are the key threats and opportunities you envisage with AI if things keep moving at its current pace? Is there anything we need to be cautious about as the industry soars?
I think there's such a range of concerns to do with, I think, the speed at which the industry is moving and the slowness. Necessarily, regulation is slow, but the slowness of the regulation of this industry, and also the slowness, and I would say the actual active depletion of kind of AI ethics teams and resources to be providing the kind of social and cultural framework that is really necessary for understanding that these technologies, they're not just kind of neutral products that get released into society, but then themselves that they are a deeply political project, and the kinds of technologies that get prioritized in companies, that get developed and deployed, and exactly how they get deployed themselves play into these existing hierarchies. They play into existing patterns of power. And so to me, I think one of the major risks is that we see an intensification of existing forms of discrimination. And I think one of the largest areas we've seen this like meaningful contestation over this has been policing, because of the ways that policing has historically been in the UK and the US context in particular, very, very deeply racist. And so I think we're seeing a lot of societal pushback on the use of AI and predictive, quote unquote, technologies for policing and broader civil society. But I think, it's important to recognize that there are a range of different ways that technological rollout, without being kind of critically questioned, could further amplify these discriminatory patterns.
Totally. And the worry is that the world now is so afraid of AI turning us all into paperclips or whatever, that people aren't talking about policing and AI anymore. In fact, I was trying to talk about it last week, and that was the thing I was repeatedly cut off about, because people aren't joining the dots between inequality and racism and sexism and extinction. Those things are all related. It's not a matter of saying extinction is more important than racism. The reason why extinction is on the cards is because we have a really undiverse bunch of people making these systems who don't actually care about ethics and ethical ways of creating AI. All those people were fired from Google when they tried to point this out. And now the community that fired them is saying, oh, we're really worried. Well, are you worried or are you not worried? Make up your mind. The thing that about policing that's really important is, and I was tracking this software called Data Miner for 2 years, and Data Miner was used in the States to track and monitor BLM protests and Muslim Lives Matter, and also to survey young people in high schools that were talking about BLM and track their presence in protests. And this technology is now being used in the UK, and the UK government have spent over £5 million on it. And in my article last week in the Byline Times, we say what the impact of this is likely to be. But we're not saying, oh, look, the AI is so scary and so amazing, it's going to rise up and do X. Not at all. We're saying that the police at the moment, unfortunately, in the UK, there is such a problem with the police, with inequality in relation to policing, with structural discrimination in relation to policing, that it is not a good moment for the police to start using these kinds of technologies that are only going to exacerbate their own political imperatives. That's the problem. The problem is much less sexy than the AI. The problem is the client AI relationship between the clients, the police, and the AI companies, the corporation. So I think that's the thing that we really need to be careful about, is these collaborations between AI companies and clients.
I agree with that. And I also think, speaking to this point of speed and the industry moving at the speed that it is. I think to some extent as well, speed begets speed. And this is something I look at quite a lot, is this rhetoric of the AI arms race, and all this idea that companies and whole countries have to be competing with one another to produce certain kinds of AI products as quickly as possible. And we certainly saw this with ChatGPT, but we've also seen it with a lot of other technologies. And this, I think, is just a really dangerous rhetoric. I think it's very dangerous in terms of how it plays into geopolitical tensions between, say, the US and China, or the US and Russia. It's also very dangerous, though, because I think it encourages people to skip those ethical steps. There's a myth that doing, AI ethics properly means that you're going to lose out in some way. And again, I'm not saying that there aren't meaningful issues around first mover advantage when it comes to things like large language models, but that simply put, this race rhetoric, it's really bad for everyone, because it really can lead, I think, globally to not only these intensifying tensions, but also just the creation of products which are simply not safe and shouldn't be rolled out at this scale. And so I do think this is a major contribution of feminist thinking about AI, is breaking away from that move fast and break things Silicon Valley mindset to a move slowly and intentionally, or question why you're doing what you're doing, and making sure that what you're producing actually brings us value instead of just creating capitalistic value for a company.
Totally. And Kerry pointed out that, during wartime, moral corners are cut. We know that things that wouldn't be permissible in everyday life seem to be okay in times of war. And that's kind of what we're seeing at the moment.
Well, thank you for such thoughtful, in-depth answers. It's been really interesting hearing them.
Thank you so much for having us on. We really appreciate it.
It's really nice to get the chance to chat.
Our next guest is Dr. Kanta Dihal, co-editor of the upcoming book, Imagining AI, How the World Sees Intelligent Machines, with Stephen Cave. Dr. Dihal is a science communication researcher at Imperial College London. Her research focuses on science narratives, particularly those that emerge from conflict, and she has advised the World Economic Forum, the UK House of Lords, and the United Nations. Our next guest is Kanta Dihal, one of the editors of the upcoming book, Imagining AI, How the World Sees Intelligent Machines. Firstly, could you tell us about yourself and how you got involved in your field?
Yes, thank you for having me. So I'm a science communication researcher at Imperial College London, and I look at the role of narratives of storytelling in shaping science and technology. And before I started my job at Imperial, until very recently, I worked at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge, where I started as a postdoc on a research project called AI Narratives. And after 3 years of working on that project, which looked at how people have been imagining artificial intelligence, particularly in the English-speaking Western world, that led to a different book with Oxford University Press called AI Narratives in 2020. I then moved on to a research project that looked at how AI has been imagined across the world, how different cultures and different linguistic and geographical and political traditions have shaped how people see intelligent machines, and how that differs and how that clashes with views of dominant countries, dominant producers of technology, or where different countries find their form of technology should be the dominant form.
Great, thank you so much. And could you tell us a little bit more about your book, Imagining AI, with Stephen Cave?
Yes, so Imagining AI comes out of 3 years of networking and building connections with people through a series of workshops in which we explored how have people been thinking about intelligent machines throughout history, and how do those traditions shape people's expectations of technology now? Because people have been imagining intelligent machines way before we started thinking about the term AI, or before we started thinking about computers as these electronic machines. And in AI Narratives, we saw that people had been imagining intelligent machines since Homer wrote his Iliad. Now, in imagining AI, we are looking at such traditions from 6 different continents, looking into the deep history of Chinese literature and philosophy, but also to contemporary responses to AI, for example, from Brazil, from India, from South Africa, to see how these responses to AI differ and depend on people's individual contexts.
That's really interesting, thank you. And imagining AI has contributions about how AI is developing from across the world. What, in your opinion, is the most interesting or perhaps the most important development going on in AI, and why?
So one of the approaches to imagining AI that I found most interesting is those artists who resist the ways in which existing technologies are being imposed from different cultural contexts to their own. So they're meeting these technologies that are not designed with them in mind, or that are designed to have a certain outcome, a certain audience in mind, and instead they take these technologies and use them for their own good, for their own entertainment, for their own political stories. And particularly we find in South America, but in post-colonial contexts around the world, you can see the ways in which people take this technology and take it apart, turn it on their heads.
Great, thank you. And imagining AI also highlights some ways in which different cultures envisage and make use of AI. Could you talk a bit about these differences?
So we saw differences across the world in many different ways, from linguistic differences that show that even what you call AI in different languages shapes how people perceive the technology differently, whether you call it something that is associated with art or with intelligence, as in something that is associated with human brain power, or whether you associate it with many other things like electronics or like social cohesion. But other ways in which people's views of AI differ is in how that's shaped by their political contexts. So that people's attitudes to AI, people's hopes and fears about the technology and what it might do today and what it might become in the future, is really closely connected to people's political and social contexts. So, for example, we have several chapters in Imagining AI focusing on thinking about intelligent machines in communist contexts. So in the Soviet Union, in mid-20th century China, and how people saw AI under different political regimes, either as something that could help make revolutions take place, could make life easier for those wanting to have an easier life, wanting to have less work, or as a threat, as something that would make people redundant and lazy and would keep people in their subservient positions they were stuck in. And in other contexts, so I've mentioned post-colonial contexts, there the fear of AI is less future-oriented than in most sort of dominant English-speaking Western contexts. So where in countries like the UK and the US, you have the dominant fear being something like the Terminator, some sort of future threat of a killer robot that might come and, actually walk up to you and shoot you. But that is not something that currently exists. That kind of fear in many post-colonial contexts is replaced by a fear of technology that exists today, or technology that is very close to existing, as just another way of exploiting people who have been exploited and subjugated by technology in past centuries. So in that sense, those responses to AI are very much on a continuum of different kinds. It's just another kind of technology that is used against us. But in some other contexts, AI is seen as a much more potentially positive force. So that's particularly some East Asian responses to AI as something that is potentially welcome, something that could help us, that could support society in ways that humans aren't able to, or that we might not have enough human workers to do, or who don't want to do it.
It's really interesting. Thank you.
Could you speak about how you think the backgrounds and culture of researchers in AI could influence the direction in which it develops?
Yes, I think the backgrounds and the cultures in which AI researchers have grown up, the cultures they're familiar with, they know about, strongly shape the kinds of technology people produce. People put their personal identities and experiences into these technologies. And particularly when there is a large group of people that share the same culture, the same values, that gets reflected into the technologies, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. And that is where biases in the technology come from. There have been so many examples of technologies that simply don't work for large groups of people because those groups of people weren't part of the context in which the developers of the technologies thought, the kinds of people who they thought might benefit from or be affected by the technology. And so that's how you get facial recognition technologies that work much better on some people than on others, which of course has huge disadvantages, but also potential advantages for the kinds of people on whom that technology doesn't work. But also things like voice assistants that don't recognize certain kinds of accents and vernaculars because they aren't considered a premium enough market. And as it has literally been said, in order to develop the technology or to train the technology in such a way that it is able to understand and respond to those kinds of voices. And the more different kinds of backgrounds and cultures are involved in AI research, the more those kinds of blind spots would be ironed out if those people's views are actually listened to in that development.
Thank you. And I was wondering if you could explain digital neocolonialism and why it is important to be aware of.
So digital neocolonialism is a name given to the process taking place in formerly colonized countries, where these countries are still or again in a subservient position to the countries that once colonized them or that once dominated them, because of the ways in which their lands and their workforces are being exploited in order to produce digital technologies. And so this can range from anything from mining rare earth metals such as lithium and cobalt to physically make the devices on which these technologies run, to extremely underpaid staff involved in training AI models, data sets, content moderation, things that some people still think is done by AI but is actually done by humans. And also then creating new forms of dependency on technologies because all of this resource has been extracted and taken to technology companies outside of these countries. There is just simply not enough left over afterwards for a country to develop its own AI infrastructure, again, with those kinds of values and priorities that these people of different backgrounds and cultures might want.
Great, thank you. And what do you think about the mainstream Western narratives of AI? Could the impact of these be holding us back scientifically?
I think in the past, it's definitely happened that a lack of attention to different cultural contexts, to different histories, has held science back, particularly in medicine, in earth sciences, where a lot of developments were actually things that, for example, indigenous populations already knew for thousands of years. Now, with AI, I think the impact of having a very small set of narratives that shape where the technology is going, I think mostly could be holding us back societally, because of technologies being created that only serve the needs and the wants of a minority group. And so what I'm afraid of is that, for example, because mainstream Western AI narratives tend to emphasize things like AI as a potential existential risk that could kill us all, that there is too much attention to these kind of distant future and small likelihood potential developments. And so there is a lot of attention and funding going into researching how to prevent that kind of apocalypse scenario, while at the same time that serves as a distraction from contemporary problems with AI, but also near future as well as long-term impacts of the kind of AI technology that might be developed today that only serves the interests of a minority group, and that could therefore do serious damage to large groups of people around the world, ranging from anywhere from the kind of environmental impacts of exploitation to the societal disruption that has been caused by the spread of misinformation, to maintaining these huge inequalities by hoarding the wealth gained out of profits from tech companies in one country while underpaying workers in another.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And the user-friendly AI chatbot, ChatGPT, has taken 2023 by storm. What are your thoughts about it, and what do you think about AI like this being freely accessible?
So the impact of ChatGPT has been really interesting because before ChatGPT, there were earlier iterations of this system that were nowhere near as sophisticated, but that you could really see developing, making huge leaps over just a few years. And in rolling out ChatGPT, I could see that they clearly learned a lot from previous GPTs and their biases. So with each of these previous iterations, people who got access to the system tried to break it, tried to provoke it into saying, racist or sexist things, trying to tease out the consequences of the fact that essentially this program was trained on the contents of the internet, and the contents of the internet contain a lot of that kind of stuff. You could see that with each iteration of GPT, that the safeguards put in place were stricter, were better thought through, were more developed. Now, of course, with ChatGPT, even you can still see that people manage to break it or provoke it in many, many different ways. But I am impressed by the ways in which they have been taking into account what went wrong in the previous instances before releasing such a system out into the wide world. But still, I think OpenAI and many on the receiving end of ChatGPT were perhaps unprepared for the social consequences of the creation of such a program. And I wonder if in some ways they have weighed up things like, on the one hand, this will make it so much easier for people to create spam and scams, but on the other hand, it will make people's lives easier in so many ways. And the weight that is given to these considerations, I think, shows what the priorities and the values are of the people behind the system. The idea, for example, that opening this out to the whole world is important to them, regardless of the potential negative social consequences, because the potential positive consequences could be so huge. Now, a new system, GPT-4, has come out very recently, which again is an improvement on ChatGPT, and that one is suddenly not publicly accessible. So it shows, in my view, that there must have been a realization that perhaps the world wasn't ready, or perhaps the system wasn't ready, or perhaps both.
Finally, where do you envisage AI going in the next 10 years? What are your hopes or fears for the future?
I find the next 10 years question a really interesting one, because with AI, it seems to be hard enough to predict the next 10 months these days. I mean, within 10 months, for example, we've had these 2 iterations of GPT, and we've had similarly in image generation as well as text generation, these massive improvements, and suddenly everybody gets fooled by pictures of the Pope in a Balenciaga puffer jacket. Things that even a year ago were pretty unimaginable. So it's very difficult to predict what might happen over the next 10 years, as it might be that there is this runaway success with improving on all these different kinds of domains and fields that AI is good in, and combining them into something that makes AI this sort of all-round intelligence that very closely would start to come to what people call artificial general intelligence. Or it could be that from now on things start to plateau, because we are getting very close to reaching a peak in what this technology can do. That at some point the improvements between GPT 5, 6, and 7 are only such small increments that it really doesn't make much of a difference anymore, which is a bit similar to, for example, how smartphones had these massive improvements from model to model, from year to year, until at some point they just kind of ran out of technologies to improve on. And so you had smartphones with 2, 3, and 4 cameras in the back just to have something to improve on. Now, there are people who are very big proponents of that first option of artificial general intelligence, which I think is unlikely given what AI is. It simply regurgitates what has been fed into it with a very clever mathematical model that just lets it produce the text that is most likely to come after a given word, and then does that millions of times so that you get a sentence that looks really natural. There already are lots of people who have been claiming that ChatGPT and things like it might be sentient or might soon be sentient. But I think that's very unlikely. Now, what I would be very interested in is seeing these massive leaps in AI combined with leaps in robotics to get these machines interacting in the real world to an extent that we don't have today. I mean, I recently moved house, and I discovered that you can get basically any imaginable appliance now that you can hook up to the internet and that is claimed to have AI in it. You know, dishwashers, washing machines, hoovers. But they don't actually have any kind of intelligent system in it. And I wonder what is going to happen over the next few years as these truly big advances in AI technology will start to enter the everyday world outside of our computers. Again, I hope that in that case, the devices that come out of that are the ones that are genuinely useful and genuinely beneficial for a lot of people, rather than just the ability to have an app to control your laundry.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
We want to thank our guests, Kerry Mcinerney, Eleanor Drage, and Kanta Dihal, for discussing AI with us on today's episode. Please check out our show notes on the OUP blog for a recommended reading list exploring just a few of the ideas discussed today. New episodes of the Oxford Comment will premiere on the last Tuesday of each month. Be sure to follow Oxford Academic on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, SoundCloud, and YouTube to stay up to date with upcoming podcast episodes. While you're at it, please do subscribe to the Oxford Comment wherever you regularly listen to podcasts, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. Lastly, we want to thank the crew of the Oxford Comment for their assistance on today's episode. Episode 82 was produced by Stephen Filippi,
Himali Rupasinghe,
and me, Hope Jennings-Grounds. Thank you for listening.